The plight of people who are being targeted by authoritarian states is not just theirs alone. It endangers, the quality of all of our freedoms and rights, and also threatens our institutions and threatens national security.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this new edition of Forum 2000 Online Chats. Today, we are with Mrs. Yana Gorokhovskaia. She is a senior research analyst at Freedom House, and she's been working in the Transnational Repression and Migration portfolio. Specifically, she was part of the team that released early this year a report called Defending Democracy from Exile, where they have exposed their findings and raised some recommendations regarding transnational repression. So thank you for being with us. And just to kick off, let's talk about what is transnational repression, how does it works, and why is it an issue right now?
Great, thanks for having me. Transnational repression, the way that we define it, is a set of tactics that governments use to reach across borders in order to silence dissent. And it can take the form of physical tactics. So these are assassinations, renditions, detentions, assaults, kidnappings. It can also take the form of non-physical or indirect tactics. So these are pressure on family members. This is harassment online. And so there's a wide universe of tactics. And really the purpose of it is to maintain an authoritarian regime by silencing those who would speak out against it, not only inside the regime's own borders, but increasingly outside of its borders. And so the work we do at Freedom House tracks this phenomenon. We've been doing this for about 3 years. We now have a data set that has 735 incidents that span from 2014 to the end of 2021. So these are all over the world, and these are only the physical incidents. So these are really just the kind of tip of the iceberg in terms of this phenomenon.
Yeah, no, listening to it and to the explanation, I think one starts to, in my case, coming from Venezuela, to remember some episodes of not just people being harassed abroad, but also their families inside the country being also harassed as a way to make pressure on activists. So how can you share with us, how does it look like from the outside of the activists, of how are they experiencing, how it's more humane rather than numbers and figures?
Well, so, I think people have heard about some of the biggest cases. So there was the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. There was the downing of the plane by Belarus last year to arrest Roman Protasevich, who was on board. But there are hundreds of other incidents that people don't hear about, partly because they happen in parts of the world where we don't have great media coverage, especially in English, but also because it has a silencing effect, right? So the purpose of this is to silence dissent, and in a lot of cases it works. So it actually does quiet the person, especially when it comes to people's family members. And as part of this research, we actually spoke to dissidents and people living in exile in the United States. As part of our previous research, we spoke to people living in Europe. And so for this report, we looked at people living in the United States. And even in a country as secure as the United States, people still feared the reach of authoritarian states, and especially those people who had family and friends abroad. And so for them, it had a lot of impacts. They stopped speaking to immediate family and friends. They no longer communicated because it put the people at risk. They didn't travel, or only traveled to a few places in the world because they were worried about being kidnapped. It isolated them from their own diaspora communities inside the United States, as other people feared being targeted because they were in contact with people who had been targeted. So the effects are really, really sort of serious, and they ripple out through communities.
Okay, so I think it's important to clarify, it's not like we have perhaps seen on movies or series of these spying activities before, perhaps in the Cold War. Right now, it has a lot of spying as well, but also have these more targeted actions against civilians at the end, not any part of foreign government.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually one of the sort of struggles about responding to transnational repression for governments where people live in exile, is because it's not traditional spying. So, we have anti-espionage laws, we have laws in place, but the people who are being targeted don't have access to any special government or military information or scientific information. And they're being targeted not because it would give some kind of advantage to the targeting state in the classic kind of Cold War espionage situation. They're being targeted because they're speaking out for fundamental human rights.
Yeah, no, it's really worrying how is it working, and rather than obviously the out of censorship and the fear of the activists, is there any other challenge they are facing or some resilience strategy they have developed? I mean, is something happening in the side of the victims in this case of transnational repression? Is something going on in there?
Well, I think we have been really pleased to see a lot of different action on this issue. So from within activists themselves, first of all, although it does have a silencing effect, we did speak to a lot of people who continue their activism in spite of being targeted. A lot of their kind of mitigation measures involve things they can do online. So digital hygiene, not sharing your location, not sharing information about your immediate family, being careful with your devices. We're increasingly seeing companies actually also offer protections to people. So enabling dual factor authentication for logging into your email, or giving people kind of one-click reporting mechanisms, that combine all the kind of harassment they've received into a readout that then you can take to the police or the FBI. And increasingly, at least here in the United States, but also in Europe, governments are paying attention to this as well. So the FBI has actually done quite a bit of work reaching out to communities who have been targeted, including Iranians, Rwandans, Uyghurs, and others, and actually telling them that this is a crime. This is a crime that will be taken seriously, and this is something that you should report. So, I think there is increasing awareness, which is leading to action, but people are still vulnerable, and often it feels like the person is alone against the power of a whole state.
Yeah, and again, and perhaps having an introduction to your recommendations. I think reading your report, there are like two different points of view. One is protecting these people being targeted in host countries. But I think the other point of view is how does world democracies can deter world autocracies to continue doing this. So what are your insights from these two sides? Protecting people being hosted in host countries, in democratic countries, most of the cases, and how can democracies deter authoritarian regimes to continue doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we focused on these two sides as you rightfully identified, because part of it is mitigating what's happening, but part of it is also ensuring accountability and actually preventing or deterring authoritarian states from pursuing these tactics. So I think, at the kind of highest level, raising this issue in bilateral meetings or multilateral meetings, taking this issue to international organizations like Interpol. There's been a lot of action on Interpol reform, more transparency so that it can't just be continually abused by authoritarian states, right? So there's action there. It's sort of, in fits and starts, but there's action at the UN, at various working groups to actually identify that there is a transnational element when people are disappeared or arbitrarily detained. At the kind of country level, there are sanctions, visa bans. There was famously the Khashoggi visa ban, which was announced after Khashoggi's murder, that applies to officials who use transnational repression. There have been sanctions. I think a couple of other steps that may not be as obvious, but we think are really important. Yeah. Looking at diplomatic staff that is stationed in the country to make sure that they are not perpetrating transnational repression. So we know that certain countries, in fact, use their diplomatic missions to harass dissidents. And so countries that are admitting diplomats have a lot of control over that, right? For diplomats that are already here, you can issue persona non grata designations. For diplomats that are incoming, you can actually refuse their diplomatic visas, right? So not give them accreditation. So there are things that you can do. Another very strong signal is limiting security assistance and financial assistance to governments that engage in transnational repression, right? And actually saying, we are freezing security assistance or putting security assistance under review because you engage not only in human rights violations at home, but in human rights violations abroad. And I think, this applies to countries like Egypt, like Rwanda, and others.
Yeah, and listening to you, I just realized that perhaps I could have been victim of this transnational repression.
Oh, wow.
Here in Switzerland a couple of years ago, in the middle of the Universal Periodic Review. We were a mission of civil society organizations coming to Geneva to explain the human rights violations in Venezuela. And we were confronted a couple of times with, both Cuban and Venezuelan officials from their embassies here in Switzerland and confronting these delegations of civil society organizations and human rights defenders. But rather than my personal experience, I would put the spotlight also in countries such as Switzerland, which are neutral in most of the conflicts in the world. Could be also Austria or Finland or some other neutral countries. Have you looked about how does neutrality influences these both sides, protection and deterrence of transnational repression?
Well, we haven't looked at the issue of neutrality specifically, but what I would say is that for a lot of countries, this is clearly for us, since we are an organization that works on human rights, this is first and foremost a human rights issue. But for a lot of governments, this is also a national security issue. If you have agents of foreign states who are operating within your country and are seeking to harm people who live here, and in a lot of instances, these people are permanent residents, they may be even citizens, right? These foreign agents are seeking to harm these people. And sometimes they go to really extreme lengths. For instance, there was a campaign in the United States against a person who was running for Congress, so who was going to be elected into US government, right? And so this is actually attacking democratic institutions in these countries. And some countries have actually begun viewing it that way. Sweden, to a certain extent, views attacks against dissidents by foreign states as an actual threat to sort of Swedish democracy. So I think, lots of governments, this is an issue for all governments. There's lots of different ways to look at it, and it doesn't really matter how aligned you are sort of internationally. And I'll just say on your experience, we looked at some of this at the UN as well. There is an effort by authoritarian states to kind of unite with like-minded governments to prevent dissidents and activists from speaking out or from even participating at various UN forums. And this is something that I think there's some attention to, but we really need to think about what these spaces are and how to protect these spaces to allow, dissident voices and activists to participate in them.
Yeah, true. My second to last question, also because of my own experience and my fellow Venezuelan experience in Latin America. Now we have seen, let's say, a wave of governments, closer to the Venezuelan regime rather than the previous one, more in the right wing. And there is some fear that because of the ideological links between these new governments in Latin America and the Venezuelan government, there could be more openness from these countries to send back people to Venezuela or comply with some requests from the Venezuelan regime. I've read in your report, it's not only happening in Venezuela, in many other countries. And what would you advise and what are your recommendations to democratic society globally to address these kind of things and to protect these people that were before, let's say, fully protected by their host country, and now they're doubting if their host countries are continuing to protect them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we talk about is ensuring and committing to the right to seek asylum. So, and especially to the right to seek asylum on the territory of the state. So increasingly over the last, I'd say 20 years or so, what we see is that various democratic governments are externalizing their borders. They are pushing people outside of their borders who are seeking asylum. And this practice puts people in danger because they are less safe in these third countries than they would be in the democratic country. And so we feel that one of the most important things that we could do to combat transnational repression is that governments need to commit to the right to seek asylum. So that's one thing. In terms of security and legal cooperation, it's important to keep in mind that authoritarian governments are really good and clever at finding ways around or to co-opt basically mechanisms that exist. Sometimes that's anti-terrorism cooperation. Sometimes that's cooperation based on organized crime. Sometimes those are, extradition treaties. And so it's increasingly an onus on host governments to examine extradition requests and to examine interventions in asylum proceedings and the degree to which they allow foreign governments to interfere or to have a say in those proceedings, and also, frankly, where they're getting information from. Right, a lot of the information that is being used in asylum cases, needs to be vetted to make sure that it's actually correct and not coming from third-party sources that may not be telling the full story.
Perfect. Great. Well, just in 1 minute, if there is any recommendation we have missed in this interview, please state them and some conclusion of this pressing situation the world is living and that has to be addressed as soon as possible.
Well, I think that one of the most important things is to raise this as an issue and to raise this as an issue of human rights and to connect increasingly in the sort of globalized world that what happens within authoritarian states in their own territories is not limited to just that territory. It extends far beyond, and also that the plight of people who are being targeted by authoritarian states is not just theirs alone. It endangers, the quality of all of our freedoms and rights, and also threatens our institutions and threatens national security. So this is really an issue for all of us, whether or not we are living in exile and whether or not we ourselves come from an authoritarian state.
Great. Many thanks for the work you're doing, for raising and speaking up for this, raising your voice for this, and well, for being here. Many thanks, Yana Gorokhovskaia from Freedom House, and thank you all for listening and continue following the Forum 2000 online chats.
Thank you.